Hi there, Vera. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Danny. It's a very beautiful day on the Morning Peninsula.
I
I'm,
know, and we're on opposite sides of the peninsula. I'm coming from Rye, and you're over in Flinders.
yes, but it's down here. That's just a short distance, I reckon.
Yeah, it's not that far, is it
I,
really?
I quite often actually go to that part of the bay, so I'm very familiar with it as well. I go kayaking.
Yeah, well, we're really spoilt down on the Mornington Peninsula to have such amazing natural landscapes surrounding us, especially over the last 6 months when we've been in various states of lockdown and sort of stuck at home a little bit. It must be pretty lucky in terms of thinking about the 5 kilometre zone that you have, the walks that you're able to go on and still engage with that beautiful sort of part of the world.
Well, when I did my first circle around my location, and I have to say this is where I live, my studio is actually not here. So I hastily packed the big old station wagon full of material and just relocated for the lockdown. But when I first looked at the circle, the radius of where you could go, I realized that more than half was actually in water. So,
It's a curse and a blessing, isn't it? It's the same here. I've got the front beach and the back beach in my 5 kilometre zone, and it means we have less land to walk on, but it means we've got beautiful coastline to enjoy.
oh, look, I decided to do a number of things really literally in the first week of lockdown, initially in April, and was um, I felt very good about then taking it up and progressing with it when the second lockdown happened. And there was a number of things. Firstly, I would work on works on paper. I would make objects like those ones that some people might be familiar with, and then use the coastal walks to look even more closely at just small spots underwater or above water. And I this time even took my magnifying glass and looked very closely at snail eggs and all sorts of materials that I just not spend time on, because you always, usually I'm just moving along and sort of get an overview and observe the tides or look if the wading birds have returned from Antarctica or Siberia. So this time I decided that I would really get back to what I initially studied, and that was microbiology all of those years ago. The other ingredient that I put in there is a particular set of literature that is to look at Thoreau
Mm.
and to look again at von Humboldt, the naturalist that's come into acute focus again now, because I think he is described now as well, some people even say the inventor of ecology, the idea of ecology.
Mm.
Ecology. So I had these sets of parameters, or these parameters to give myself a framework within which to operate every day.
Mm.
And it's been really, really wonderful, but I feel fortunate to be able to do that down here. If I was stuck in Moorabbin, it would have been absolutely depressing.
Mm. Yeah,
There's not much happening there, and it's only just waking up now.
yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, I guess, your experience of Western Port and that amazing ecology on that side of the bay. And also, I guess, about the reef systems that are over your way that are quite fascinating and not a lot of people really are aware of the sort of the amazing nature of them.
Yes, it's this region is quite amazing for really a number of reasons, but what I might like to do is to come back to the acknowledgement of the Bunurong people who've been here, and it's been described by an archaeologist who works for the Bunurong Aboriginal Land Corporation. He told me, and he wrote in a catalogue essay, that this landscape's really the outcome of old river systems and plains, floodplains, and really only filled up with water about, I think, 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. So for the indigenous populations that roamed between Werribee and down to Wilson's Promontory, for them too, it's a relatively young cultural landscape. You know, they've been on the southeastern coast of Australia for, I think he says, 35,000 years. So to come into this region that's relatively new to them. And they found just what we find now, an incredibly diverse bioregion that's acknowledged worldwide. And one of the sites that some people might be familiar with is the mangrove belt on the northern part of Western Port. They say that about, I think, 95 to 98% is still intact, but that's also why we've taken up the fight against AGL, because there is a campaign by many people that live in this region and many others that know about the importance that you do not want to disturb the ecological balance of this region. And interestingly, the first survey of Western Port by Western scientists happened in the 1960s, and the Fisheries and Wildlife Department engaged scientists to look at Western Port because of the port development at Hastings and Crib Point. And I'm very good friends with one of our senior scientists. His specialty is crustacea. He's a world expert on the crustacea in this region, especially. And he happened to be on that first survey. You know, he was a young scientist coming from New Zealand. So through all of those people investigating what we find here, look, there's so much to name. People might be familiar with the idea of a Ramsar site, which is a protected wetland in the north of the bay where birds can land and feed. That's really significant. We find such a rich marine life in this bay, and then across the coastline towards Port Phillip Bay. And really, we have Bass Strait, which is an elevated seafloor, but then on both sides towards Wilson's Promontory and towards Portland, that drops away and goes into the deep southern ocean. And a number of scientists have really helped us focus in recent years on the fact that we have the Great Southern Reef that stretches all along the coast. And there's a wonderful man, his name is Mark Norman. He used to work at Museum Victoria, and he is a very well-known octopus specialist. And you might all know him from the dissection of the giant octopus years ago. That was a public dissection of this huge creature. But Mark is now Chief Officer for Parks Victoria in regard to sustainability and future, you know, the outlook what climate change might do to this entire landscape. And he and his colleagues have for a while now pointed towards the incredible importance of the Great Southern Reef, because it is even richer in terms of biological diversity, richer than the Great Barrier Reef. Up there we have, Great Barrier Reef has warmer waters. Obviously it goes through various regions itself up into the tropics. But here it's a cold water zone, and very, very rich kelp forest all the way along that's significant to breed for fish, for all sorts of creatures. But everybody will understand that until fairly recently, you just couldn't dive there. It was too difficult. The equipment wasn't developed. It was really through people like Jacques Cousteau in the 60s and 70s, where diving equipment is better developed. But that said, locals, if you look at the coast from here down to Lawn, locals that snorkeled and dived have always known that if you travel out just a few hundred meters, there is this incredibly rich zone full of sponge gardens and underwater marine life. So to me, that is, as an artist, that becomes incredibly exciting. I originally studied biology and microbiology in Munich before I came to Australia, and there I specialized on freshwater ecology. My job was to grab the Munich University lab van, that was an old VW van, it had lab equipment, and then do the circuit around the Bavarian lakes south of Munich and gather water samples for my professors. And my job was then to sit down at the microscope, look through it, and see what was suspended in these samples. And then my job was to draw what I saw. These are microalgae. They quite graphic forms. People might be familiar with those, or perhaps not. And then I had to count them. It was extremely laborious, and a job that required extreme patience, which is something my late husband, the artist Philip Hunter, used to say, "Sweetheart, you are so not patient." And practically everything that I do now in the studio too, making objects like that, or collages or paint, seriously, everything that I do requires so much patience. And I don't know how that has happened, but that's how it is, and I absolutely love it. My real fascination is with marine invertebrates, and one of the most wondrous, I think that's generally acknowledged, the most wondrous marine invertebrate is a nudibranch. And it's a little marine slug, but they have the most, some of them have the most extraordinary patterning and vivid contrast. And whenever I see a nudibranch that's brightly coloured, and I look at my painting, I seem to fall short of reaching the kind of sort of the pizzazz of that exciting luminosity. But that's really where I focus. I never illustrate at all. I'm not interested in that. I am actually trained up as a biological illustrator, and that's, I think, a very important background to my practice. I was very, very fortunate to be taught in Würzburg. Before I went to Munich, I studied in Würzburg. And the professor who taught us in our first year of biological illustration, which is, you have to do that subject for, I think, 3 semesters. We were incredibly fortunate because we were taught by an emeritus professor, and his name was Professor Wohlfahrt, and he was unique as a teacher. He was probably 83 by that time. But his life's work had been a 4-volume encyclopedia of the world's butterflies. And scientific illustration is a precise undertaking. In biological illustration, you have no room to make things up. But he had flair. In his 4-volume encyclopedia of Middle Europe's butterflies, he actually had done all of the illustrations, but somehow he's managed to illustrate details correctly, but with poetic flair. So they're sensational illustrations. It's very, very rare. It doesn't really often happen that an illustrator somehow brings something extra to it. Professor Wohlfahrt also maintained half an anthill in his office. And his office has been sort of, what could I call it? It's been an inspiration to my entire practice as an artist, to my studio life and how I work in the studio, because Professor Wohlfahrt's office was so densely packed with drawings on the wall, diagrammatic drawings, pinned butterflies, collections of butterflies, very rare Japanese brushes, bookshelves laden with information. You could hardly move. I mean, in today's universities, it would have been a health hazard. I think it would have probably been closed down, fire hazard. Munich University, Würzburg University allowed him to be like that in the 70s. And then in the middle of all of this extravagantly rich visual material, there was a glass pane, and behind it was half an anthill. And that wasn't Professor Wohlfahrt's anthill. It belonged to another researcher who didn't have enough space in his own office. But I talk about it with enthusiasm and with great respect, because to have a person like that, an accountant, has truly enriched my life in many ways, to become very focused, to become very precise when needed. But when I finally went to art school, I got the elbow room to move out of precision into just imagination. And I then decided when I arrived here in Australia that I wanted to become a mature age student and just use the subject of biology, the larger framework, as conceptual background for what I would do. So having arrived here in Australia and having studied art at first at Paran and then at the VCA, I really became, artists know about obsession, so I became seriously interested in the Great Barrier Reef. I met some of the scientists. I had a residency on Heron Island. And now that's a very sad story. You have this glorious natural environment that is so expansive that it can be, as it's been described, it's the only living organism that can be seen from space. Over 3,000 kilometers long. And with my interest in the Great Barrier Reef, I then eventually shifted down here to our own environment. We're talking about a period of, I know it's 4 decades now. So talking again about Western Port and Port Phillip Bay, to summarize what I've already said, it's incredibly biodiverse. The biodiversity is specific to this region, so they're endemic. Some of these incredible creatures underwater are not to be found anywhere else in the world. And I make work about the idea of thinking about the hybridization that happens down there. So what sort of future species we might find, but inevitably in that thought, or coupled with that thought, is which species have we already lost? The marine invertebrates as species are so alien and otherworldly that they are very interesting for an artist to look at, because they just, if I just think of the elephant snail, that's this slug with this white, it's got this little lid. That looks like a Star Wars stealth bomber. When it moves, it's incredibly beautiful. And now that I've got my magnifying glass, you look at its skin and it's actually opalescent and it shimmers. There are visual phenomena that I've become very, very interested in and try to not replicate, but I think about them, and I've found some ways of at least trying to bring them into painting and drawing and collage making. In the liquid medium, that is the salty water, the creatures that live there communicate in a particular way. So most famous is probably the octopus. If you go out there and you find an octopus in a rock pool, as I did on the first day after we had settled here, I walked down and it was after sunset and I could see just low down the rock pools and then the sun behind it. And there was something that sort of came up out of a rock pool, and I thought, but that's weird. Something living is there. I walked up and it was an octopus. And this octopus was that's about the size, but it had these arms. The octopus saw me because I hovered over it, and then went through this insane display of what I now know is anger. It became orange, and then that wasn't enough. I had a little stick, and I must admit, I just got the stick a bit closer to it, and what it did then, it retracted back into the water, but did 3D surface articulation to try to look like the rock. It could see that it couldn't escape. It's incredible. So these kinds of phenomena are so amazing. We don't even really know how it all functions. They're specialists at looking at all of that. But coming back to just the broader range of visual phenomena for an artist are incredibly interesting. So bioluminescence, phosphorescence, opalescence, iridescence, where things shimmer, when the rain goes through the rainbow colors. Then there are these material qualities underwater. If you look at just a little sponge garden or waving sea lettuce, it's the elasticity. They're often transparent materials. So all of that I feed on, I go up and see it. And in painting, that is a big proposition. How can you work on a flat surface, you work with not three-dimensionality. So I've developed a technique to try to replicate flow patterns and all of that. With the collages that are constructed a little bit like this very large one that are made preceding all collages. The collages feed on some of the patterns that you can see on shells. You know, people, audience will be familiar with the marine shells that you find down here, the checker pattern on these little snails. Or my favorite snail down here is the painted lady, it's called, or also called the pheasant shell. But coming back to the collages, and I bring them up because you have in your exhibition 4 framed collections of those. I think of these as collections of imaginary marine invertebrates. They're clearly a fantasy. However, there are some ingredients in the making of them, the layering of multiples, that is a reference to the very simple constructions of some sea worms or some shells even. You know, often you have multiple units. Or if you think of a centipede, you know, you've got 100 times the same unit. So therefore, this kind of collage making lends itself to that. Maybe I should quickly say these collages are not flat. They're glued in a way where they can assume a very fairly flat 3-dimensional form. And they're also hinged. They're floating above the paper. And so they cast just very small shadows. So they do look as if they were, you know, they have 3-dimensionality. I think that's really exhausted my repertoire here for you.
No, I've been hypnotized listening to your wonderful discussion. It's been, yeah, I can't think of really a more appropriate location for you to be in, to be honest, down in Flinders with that amazing rawness of the landscape and the ocean sort of lapping up at your doorstep almost. And it's really been quite illuminating to hear you talk about, I guess, the background to your practice, and especially, I guess, the freedom or the opportunity to step out of that scientific background and quite technical drawing aspect into more of a sort of creative freedom and expressive freedom, which really comes through in your practice and your work. And it's so nice to see you making work about Western Port and about that part of the world. It's so beautiful.
Well, I'm fortunate to have found a niche for myself. You know, I've really, I've in a way lucked it out that I've been able to bring all of these elements together, and because of the incredible richness of this environment, there's always more to discover. It's very, very wonderful. But I would like to say at this point that if I have in my larger practice in, you know, object making, and I've just shown up at Goma 2 works that were made specifically about Western Port. There's a piece that involved about 3,500 objects that in the Queensland Art Gallery they had allowed me to display in a specially built room that was illuminated with UV or black light. And then the lighting engineer had constructed a computerized sequence that would shift from light to dark and back. And all of these glowing fingers that I've made, really the idea, it was a fantasy, a surreal fantasy, but I really wanted to say to people, look at the mangrove air roots. You know, they are in this awful muddy zone. I mean, if you get stuck in the mud around the mangroves, that stinks and it is awful, but it is incredibly important. That's where, when the tide hits the mangroves, that's fish breeding. That's where birds nest. And if you look, it's stunningly complex, beautiful, and it's beautiful. It has its own beauty if you can see it. But most importantly, it needs to be kept intact. And I think this is a good opportunity to say that Parks Victoria have a great site where everybody can contribute what they see if they go underwater. So the scientists use all of these extra data to actually accumulate catalogues of knowledge. And I've said before that it's a relatively new area for scientific exploration because humans could simply not go there. You know, it's really an activity that's happened only in the last, well, let's say 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, well, it's very important, isn't it, to be able to really bring together that sort of people power a little bit, to be able to use that sort of broader knowledge that people can pull in to help the scientific sort of understanding of our rich landscape.
Yeah, so I mean, you're all part of, or people that visit, or people that actually live on the Mornington Peninsula. It's all part of a much larger global push. This is not just down here, to engage schools, people that are sick of television and just want to count something at night. You can log onto these programs, and I remember 4 years ago I couldn't sleep, and so I logged onto a particular website that I'd connected with doing research on malleefowl. And what it was is just hours and hours of footage of an automatic camera watching a malleefowl site, and the camera would be triggered off by foxes or snakes or anything moving, threatening the eggs that had been laid there. So the job was, because no PhD student or researcher has the time to go through literally thousands of hours of footage. So we can all do that, and then you get a quick explanation of what to look for. But for instance, I saw that schools were looking at the invasion of sea stars, crown of thorns in Tasmania. And it's very easy if you look at a photograph and you just count how many are there, and then you fill that out. So everybody's doing that now.
Yeah, no, it's great, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and chatting with me today. It's been really brilliant to hear about your practice, and I'm glad that we get to share that with a wider audience. And it's been great to have those beautiful collages of yours on display as part of our MPRG 50 exhibition. And look forward to speaking with you more in the future and working with you in the future.
That's marvelous. Yes, thank you. I'm excited too. It's a wonderful gallery to go to for me, because I can also see what other artists have done in the past with that whole region, and bringing that into contemporary thinking as well. What current younger generations now, how they embrace all of that. So it's really marvelous to go there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Vera, and speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.